Real stories, real shocks. Are you ready? Subscribe now.
I'm not one of those women who look for an excuse to cheat. My life with my husband was normal, stable, predictable, without major arguments, but also without passion. We had been living together for 7 years, and over that time, I had learned to read his moods and facial expressions. He was kind, caring, but something was missing. When I met Mark, my colleague, it all started with simple conversations. We worked on the same project and often stayed late in the office. He was charming, confident, and with him I felt different, desired. One evening, when almost everyone else had left the office, he invited me for coffee at a nearby cafe. "You need a break too," he said with a warm smile. I agreed. Nothing special, just a cup of coffee between colleagues. But that night, I came home later than usual. My husband asked, "You stayed late?" I gave him a casual answer, not thinking much of it. But this was just the beginning. Each day, Mark and I grew closer. I began to catch myself waiting for his message, choosing my clothes more carefully when I knew he'd be in the office. We texted even at night, first about work, then just about life. The first time it happened, I told my husband that I had an urgent meeting and would stay at the office later. But instead, Mark and I went to a hotel. My hands trembled, and my heart was pounding so fast that I could barely breathe. It was risky, but with him, the excitement was something I hadn't felt in years. From that night on, everything changed. Our meetings became regular. We met at hotels, at his place, sometimes even after work in the car in a parking lot. He knew I was married, but it didn't stop us. On the contrary, the risk made it even more thrilling. I learned to be careful. I always deleted messages, kept my phone in my bag, and changed my perfume before coming home. I came up with new excuses: the gym, meeting friends, work. But my husband started noticing the changes. He asked why I stayed late so often, why I spent less time at home. At first, these were simple questions, and I easily found answers. But then, I saw doubt in his eyes. One day, when I came home, he looked at me longer than usual. "You smell different," he said. I froze but quickly responded, "It's a new cream I bought today." He nodded, but I saw the doubt in his eyes. A week later, he asked, "Why do you always keep your phone close? You used to forget where it was." I laughed, calling him paranoid. But inside, a sense of fear began to grow. The next time I was with Mark, my phone rang. It was my husband. I knew that if I didn't answer, he would be even more suspicious. So, I picked up, trying to sound calm. "Hi, I'm still at the office," I said, trying to hide my racing breath. He stayed silent for a moment, then said, "Okay, I just wanted to hear your voice." In that moment, my heart clenched. The worst came when my husband decided to surprise me by picking me up from work. I was in bed with Mark when my phone rang. I panicked, got dressed faster than I ever had, and ran. I had to go through dark alleys to avoid the office before getting into the car. "Why are you so tense?" my husband asked when I got in the car. "Just tired," I replied, trying to hide my breathlessness. He didn't say anything else, but his eyes said more than words ever could. I thought everything was under control. but my husband started noticing more and more changes in me. He began asking about my late returns home and my new habits. But I was careful, always coming up with explanations, excuses, leaving no evidence behind. One day, he looked at me suspiciously when I came home and asked, "Were you really at work?" I laughed, trying to sound casual. "Yes, just got delayed a bit with extra tasks." He nodded, but I noticed doubt in his eyes. However, he didn't say anything more. From that point on, I realized I needed to end things with Mark if I wanted peace in my family. I decided to sever all ties with him. I tried explaining to Mark several times that I couldn't continue meeting him because it was putting me in a very dangerous situation. He was disappointed, but didn't push me to change my decision. Gradually, my husband started asking fewer questions. My explanations became more convincing, and his suspicions faded away. I began to feel like everything was getting back to normal. I made more of an effort to be a good wife, focusing more on home life and our relationship. We went back to our usual life, and although I felt guilty, I couldn't let go of the connection I had with Mark. However, I now realize that sacrifices needed to be made to keep the family intact. My husband never found out the truth. Second love. When it became a game. My next affair started on my initiative. It was with a trainer at the gym. My husband started noticing that I was paying more attention to my appearance, but I found the perfect excuse. I was simply taking care of myself. I got myself a separate phone. Small, cheap, always left in my car. I created a new schedule, running in the evenings, attending yoga on Saturdays. In reality, I was going to see him. One of the most intense situations happened when my husband decided to surprise me and pick me up after yoga. I remember rushing out of my lover's apartment, barely catching my breath, running through dark alleys so he wouldn't see me leaving another building, jumping into the car and pretending I was just exhausted. My husband suspected nothing, and for the first time, I felt the real thrill of risk. After that incident, I realized things could go wrong, but that only made it more exciting. My meetings with the trainer became more frequent. I no longer saw it as a forbidden indulgence. It was a challenge, a game where the main goal was not to lose. I invented new excuses, extra yoga classes, a marathon that required long training sessions. My husband just nodded, sometimes joking about my new obsession with fitness, but never digging deeper. One evening, after another session with the trainer, I came home a bit later than planned. My husband was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He looked up at me. "How was your training?" he asked, setting the phone aside. "Tough," I sighed, pretending to be exhausted. "The trainer really pushed me today." He smiled. "That's good. Do you like this sport?" "Yes, a lot," I replied, looking him straight in the eye. And at that moment, the phone in my bag vibrated. Not the one I used every day, the other one. I felt a chill run through me. My husband didn't notice, but I knew. One day I might not be fast enough to mute the sound, not quick enough to hide the evidence. But instead of fear, I felt an even bigger rush of excitement. After that close call, I decided to be more careful. But against all logic, I didn't want to stop. In fact, I wanted more. My meetings with the trainer became routine. At first, they were quick encounters in his apartment after yoga, but soon we got bolder. We started meeting in the mornings. I would go for a run, but in reality, I was driving to him. Sometimes we would sneak into empty locker rooms at the gym when no one was around. I felt like a teenager tasting forbidden fruit for the first time. He was nothing like Mark. Mark had been gentle, caring, a true romantic. The trainer, on the other hand, was rough, passionate, dominant. With him, I felt something I never felt in my marriage. One day, he suggested we go out of town, rent a cottage for the weekend. It was a risk, but I agreed. I told my husband I was going on a yoga retreat, turned off my main phone, and took only the other one. We spent the entire weekend together, as if we lived in a different world. I fell asleep in his arms, forgetting about my family, ignoring my husband. But when I got home, a surprise was waiting for me. My husband was sitting in the kitchen, his expression unreadable. "How was the retreat?" he asked, studying me closely. "It was amazing. A real reset." I smiled, trying to sound natural. "Strange." He pressed his lips together. "I wanted to surprise you and visit the center, but you weren't there." My heart jumped. "What?" I feigned shock. "You must have made a mistake. We were in a separate area with no phones." I spewed excuses like a machine, and I think it worked. He sighed, shaking his head. Maybe I really got it wrong, but I knew this was the first alarm bell. A little more, and everything would fall apart. Yet instead of fear, I felt something else. Adrenaline. I didn't want to stop. With each new meeting, I started noticing things I had ignored before. He was attractive, passionate, knew how to handle a woman. But outside of bed, we had nothing to talk about. His jokes became predictable, his stories repeated, and our meetings started feeling mechanical. What once felt like an adventure and a rush of risk had turned into just another habit. One day, we sat in his car, parked in a secluded spot. He was talking about some gym drama, and I realized I wasn't even listening. I looked at him and felt nothing. "Something wrong?" he asked, noticing my distant look. "No, just tired," I lied. But the truth was, I was tired of him. Tired of this double life. Tired of constant control, lies, the second phone, the fear of being caught. The next time he asked to meet, I refused. "Are you serious?" He frowned. "Yes. I think it's time to end this." He looked at me for a few seconds as if trying to decide whether I was joking. "You're just exhausted. It'll pass," he smiled. "No, it won't." I saw his smile fade. He texted me a few more times, invited me to meet, hinted that I would change my mind. But I never answered. I returned to my normal life. My husband stopped asking about my training because I gradually stopped going. I erased all traces, threw away the second phone. Everything was supposed to go back to normal. But something had changed. Not in my marriage. Not in my husband. In me. The third man. When things got serious, his name was Evan. This was a completely different story. While with the trainer everything had been rough and passionate, and with Mark it was intimate and tender, with Evan, everything became serious. From the very beginning, he stated that he wanted more. that he didn't want to be just a temporary fling, but a part of my life. And that was amazing, because I began to see in him not just a man for a short affair, but a possibility for something bigger. He became a different dimension in my world. We had been meeting for almost a year. This time was filled with tenderness, passion, and promises that I started to believe in. I could feel my attitude towards him changing. He had that same charisma, but with a softness I desperately needed. He was someone I could imagine my future with. Unlike the others, he was ready for a serious relationship. However, with every passing month, his demands grew more decisive. He began pressuring me, not understanding that it was hard for me to make a choice. He said we were made for each other and that I should leave my husband. His words became so convincing that I started to doubt what I was doing. His pressure made me anxious, but at the same time, it gave him a certain advantage in my thoughts. I began to feel that this story might go beyond what I had initially planned. Before, it had been just short-lived games. But with Evan, I started to seriously think about a long-term relationship. And although my husband suspected nothing, I felt more and more trapped. And I lied to him. I said I would file for divorce, but I needed time. I was afraid to be honest with him, not ready to lose everything I had. I was scared to look at the man who had been my husband and admit that this part of my life might be over. To hide this, I started paying more attention to every detail. I bought new perfume. Now, when I was with him, it became my symbol of secrecy. It was a ritual, a way for me to separate myself from my husband at home. I always checked to make sure there was no hair left on my clothes, no trace of him. It became a habit, a small game where every step required careful attention. Every time I came home, before kissing my husband, I would go to the bathroom and carefully wash my lips. It became part of my ritual. I tried to be flawless, so no one would notice my double life. The more I got involved, the more fear I felt, but also excitement. One day, I sat in my car before going inside, feeling my heart beat faster. I could no longer think about how this would end because it had already become a part of me. Now everything was serious, and I couldn't stop playing this game. It became a new phase in my life, and I couldn't stop, even though I realized how much I was risking. The meetings with Evan became more frequent and more intense. At first, it was just quiet and pleasant evenings at his apartment. We often went to parties, where he was impeccably elegant, and I couldn't take my eyes off his confidence. Those moments made me feel special, like I was his queen in this little world where we lived without any worries. But the more we met, the more serious our conversations became. Evan began to open up to me, telling me about his ambitions, his dreams, his willingness to do anything to be with me. I could feel how he clung to me, how my feelings for him mixed with doubts about what I was doing. From time to time, he would ask about my relationship at home, and although I always gave vague answers, his gaze was too penetrating not to feel that he suspected something. At some point, I started to lose control of the situation. Once, when we met at a small cafe, he gently touched my hand and, looking me in the eyes, said, "You can't live like this, constantly hiding, choosing between us. You need to make a choice." Panic overtook me. I knew he was right, but I couldn't allow myself to lose everything I had built over the years. On the other hand, I felt that this was my chance to experience real passion again, the kind I had lost. So, I started leaving my husband at home on weekends, choosing time for meetings with Evan. This was no longer just an adventure, it became something bigger. We planned to spend weekends out of town, and this was very important for us. I told my husband that I was going away to visit a friend, and although he asked why I was disappearing so often, I convinced him that I just needed a break. When we met with Evan for the weekend, I felt that this was more than just spending time together. We went out of town to a small cottage, where everything was very romantic. His hand holding mine made me feel both vulnerable and strong at the same time. I forgot about everything, even my other reality. And only when we came back did I realize how much more I would need to hide. And although I tried to live a double life, Evan, with each meeting, began demanding more. He started asking when I would divorce, when we could be together without secrets and lies. This became a heavy burden for me. I could no longer just manipulate the situation. It had become too serious, too dangerous. The last meeting before I decided to end everything was very tense. We were sitting in his car, and he brought up the topic of my relationship again. I felt my words becoming less convincing. "You're still not ready, are you?" he asked quietly. I didn't answer, but deep down I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I was torn between two lives, and it couldn't go on any longer. The next day, I called him and said that we had to end things. I knew this decision would break his heart, but I also knew it was the only right choice for me. When I ended things with Evan, I could no longer live in a world of lies, but my husband never found out anything. I hid everything. The quiet, peaceful routine remained. I returned to my usual life, to our dinners together, and everything seemed to stay the same. But one thought haunted me. Should I tell him the truth? Or is it better to leave it in the past and hide it for the rest of my life? If I did, everything might fall apart, and I wasn't ready to risk everything we had built together. On the other hand, I felt that keeping it to myself would be enough to stop feeling the pressure, and to at least keep some part of my dignity. What do you think? What would you do in my place? Should I tell him everything, even if it ruins what we have, or keep hiding it and live as if nothing happened?
Thank you for subscribing. More shocking stories ahead.